Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that's damp, dusty, and downright dreadful but also oddly fascinating. Picture this, the sun has barely risen, but the streets of a medieval town are already alive with the sounds of clanging hooves, loud market sellers, and something less pleasant. The air is thick not with morning dew, but with the unmistakable scent of a place that's forgotten what clean means. You wrinkle your nose, a rat scurries by. Welcome to the Middle Ages where hygiene was more of a hopeful rumor than a daily routine. And trust me, if you lived here, you wouldn't have lasted a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. Are you in bed already? Or just winding down? Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking down a narrow, cobblestone street, your boots squishing into something that definitely isn't mud. It's hard to tell what's water, what's waste, and what's just centuries of grime. The buildings lean toward each other as if gossiping over your head, and every open window seems to breathe out another puff of musty, unwashed air. Welcome to the heart of a medieval town, where personal space is non-existent and your nose is under constant attack. A woman empties a chamber pot right out of a second-story window. Garde low. She shouts a warning in French that literally means watch out for the water, but it's not water, and it's definitely not something you'd want to be caught under. You jump back just in time, but your sleeve wasn't so lucky. This is your first lesson. Streets were not for strolling, they were open sewers. And no, that isn't just an expression. In the absence of proper plumbing, townspeople tossed waste, both human and animal, straight onto the roads. Rain helped move things along, sort of. But in summer, let's just say the stench could knock out a knight in full armor. And speaking of knights, don't let the gleaming armor fool you. Underneath those polished plates, the odor was often unbearable. Imagine being wrapped in layers of sweat-soaked padding during a battle, with no access to soap for weeks. Yes, they were chivalrous, but not exactly charming up close. You duck into a side alley, trying to escape the worst of the smell, only to discover it's worse here. A butcher's shop spills blood into the gutter. A tanner's workshop nearby releases fumes so foul they were banned from most city centers. Fun fact, tanning leather required soaking animal hides in urine. Yes, urine, collected from public urinals. Imagine being the guy whose job was to carry buckets of wee through the town square. And don't assume that peasants were the only ones swimming in filth. Castles, those grand symbols of wealth and power, weren't much better. Sure, some had garderobes, that's medieval talk for toilets, which emptied directly into the moat. Sounds convenient, right? Until you realize the moat was also filled with rotting food, dead animals, and whatever else got thrown out of the kitchens. Let's just say no one was swimming laps for fun. Here's something wild. People didn't necessarily mind the smell. In fact, the idea that body odor was offensive is fairly modern. Back then, strong smells were just a part of life. They even believed certain stenches were healthy, like the earthy scent of manure, which was thought to ward off illness, you know. Natural aromatherapy. Doctors of the day subscribed to the theory of the miasma, the belief that disease traveled through bad air. So they'd wave around sweet-smelling herbs or wear beaked masks stuffed with lavender to cleanse the air around them. Ironically, they were half right. Air quality did matter, but their methods were, well, less than effective. And yes, you're probably wondering, did they ever bathe? Well, that depends. In some parts of Europe, public bathhouses were once common. People would gather to soak, scrub, and socialize. It wasn't all cleanliness, though. These baths sometimes doubled as brothels, which led to their eventual decline because, you know, sin. By the late Middle Ages, bathing became suspiciously associated with immorality and disease. Some even believed that opening your pores through warm water made you vulnerable to illness. So many chose to stay crusty. Of course, not everyone was walking around with decade-old dirt on their skin. Wealthier folks had access to scented cloths, dry powders, and even homemade deodorants like crushed rose petals mixed with animal fat. Effective, debatable, sticky, absolutely. Here's a strange detail you probably didn't expect. Many medieval people changed their clothes more often than they bathed. Underclothes, especially linen garments, were considered the first layer of cleanliness. They absorbed sweat and grime, and when they got too gross, they were boiled and bleached. So yes, your medieval self might not shower, but at least your undershirt was getting a spa day. Some historians even argue that hygiene wasn't uniformly bad across the entire medieval period. Early medieval societies had cleaner water sources and communal washing practices. It was later, during urban crowding and religious reformations, that hygiene started circling the drain literally. But of course, scholars still debate this. Maybe it wasn't all as filthy as we imagine. Or maybe our standards are just impossibly high. So, as you step over another suspicious puddle and pull your cloak tighter around you, you start to wonder, how did anyone survive this? And yet, they did. They fell in love, they wrote poetry, they farmed, and they danced in the streets, filthy streets, sure but full of life all the same. And now, as the distant sound of a church bell echoes through the fog, you walk deeper into the town, wondering what other unwashed secrets this place might be hiding. You follow the smell. You don't mean to, of course, but the breeze shifts and something pungent, sharp, and almost sweet catches in your throat. It's not just the waste in the streets this time. It's something older, deeper. You round a corner and stumble into a sight you won't forget. A man in a long apron is standing in his doorway, casually dumping a sloshing bucket of brown liquid straight onto the cobblestones. It splashes your boots. Again, you sigh. Welcome to the neighborhood. This is the reality of life in a world without toilets. And not just private bathrooms, but any formal sewage system at all. That means no flushing, no pipes, no treatment plants, just gravity, buckets, and a lot of wishful thinking. It might be hard to believe, but for most of the Middle Ages, even the most bustling towns didn't have proper drains. Instead, everything was thrown outside. Chamber pots were standard, ceramic bowls for nighttime business. In the morning, out the window it went, ideally with a shouted warning. But let's be real, people weren't always polite. So if you were unlucky, and most people were, you could be walking home with more than just bread in your basket. To cope with the mess, some towns developed makeshift solutions. Stone gutters were carved down the middle of roads to carry off rainwater and, coincidentally, everything else. These were called kennels in English towns. But in dry seasons, they became clogged, stagnant trenches. Imagine a summer day with no breeze, the gutters stewing like a soup of misery. It's no wonder that shoes were thick-soled and clothing hung long to shield the legs from splashes. Some wealthier homes did try to improve things. Manor houses and castles occasionally had garderobes, basically toilets that opened onto the outside wall, where waste would fall into a pit or directly into the moat. Elegant, right? The word garderobe literally means to guard robes, because people believed the ammonia from the waste would kill moths. So sometimes they actually hung their clothes there. Yep, medieval closet meets outhouse. And this isn't even the weird part yet. You wander past a communal stable, where horses are stomping and snorting, and notice a group of people crouch nearby, men, women, even kids. What are they doing? Well, using the same space as the horses, because for many poor laborers, stables were public restrooms, warm, discreet, and already smelly. It wasn't ideal. But in a town without privacy, sometimes the haystack was the best option. Of course, church doctrine had something to say about all this. Monasteries, those solemn places of prayer and penance, often included rudimentary sanitation. The monks built latrines that emptied into streams or pits, and they had rules about washing before meals or after certain tasks, but these were exceptions. Out in the real world, such luxury was rare. Here's a fun fact you didn't ask for. In many medieval towns, sanitation was actually regulated by law. There were officials, muck collectors, essentially tasked with maintaining cesspits and collecting waste. They were called gong farmers in England, and their job was to empty the latrines and carry the contents out of town at night. By hand, it was one of the highest paid jobs for the poor, but also one of the most reviled. No surprise there if you ever hear someone described as being at the bottom of the ladder. Remember, someone literally had to clean the bottom. Some cities were cleaner than others. Islamic cities like Baghdad and Cordoba had advanced sewer systems, and even public baths well into the early medieval period. But in most of Europe, filth was just part of the landscape. People grew up with it. Children played in it. Vendors sold food next to it. You weren't expected to be pristine just to stay alive. Still, there were moments of effort. Civic pride occasionally pushed towns to enforce street cleaning days, or fine people for dumping waste in the wrong place. Did it help? Marginally. But without the infrastructure, it was like pouring perfume into a cesspit and calling it springtime. And, speaking of perfume, you're starting to notice that the smell has layers. Beneath the sharp sting of waste, there's the greasy tang of frying fish, the soft rot of old vegetables, and the sick sweet scent of flowers someone has hung in their window in vain. Maybe to trick the nose, maybe just for hope, you duck into a small covered passageway, quiet, shady, damp. The stones beneath your feet are slick. In the corner, a child is crouched, urinating casually against the wall. No one scolds him. Why would they? It's just part of life. And that's the strange thing. You start to realize that no one here seems disgusted. Annoyed, sure. Inconvenienced, yes. But grossed out, not really. Because when everyone lives in the same grime, it doesn't stand out. It just is. Medieval people didn't have germ theory. They didn't understand bacteria or waterborne illness. They just knew that some places made them sick and others didn't. So they developed their own logic. Bad smells were dangerous. Certain winds brought disease. Evil lingered in dark, moist places. In some ways, they were trying to make sense of an invisible world with the tools they had: smell, instinct, and centuries of superstition. And historians still debate how effective their methods were. Some argue that the constant exposure actually toughened immune systems. Others say that medieval cities were death traps for infants and the elderly. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, buried under layers of muck and misunderstanding. You step out of the alley and onto a small stone bridge. Beneath it, a sluggish stream winds through the town. It's not crystal clear. In fact, it's brown with bubbles that don't bode well. But a woman is down there washing clothes anyway, slapping linen against the rocks and humming a soft, steady tune. Life goes on. You pause to watch her. The sun is setting behind the rooftops, casting long golden rays through the dust. The town begins to quiet. A candle flickers in a window. A dog barks somewhere down the lane. And through it all, the air still smells like history, raw and rank and real. But now you know, behind every cobblestone, every crooked building, every castle wall, there's a story not just of kings and knights but of waste, of water, of survival, of people doing what they could with what they had. And now, you take a deep breath, well, maybe just a shallow one, and keep walking. The night is falling, and there's still so much filth to explore. You walk deeper into town as twilight begins to settle over the rooftops like a smoky veil. The air thickens, not just with fog, but with warmth from bodies, hearth fires, and centuries of habits baked into the very stones. Somewhere nearby, someone's burning tallow. The smell is waxy, fatty, almost like a mix of old candles and overcooked meat. And then a new scent hits you. Damp wood, wet feet, and steam. You found the bathhouse. Now. Don't get too excited. This isn't your spa day fantasy. There are no fluffy robes or cucumber water here. What you see instead is a squat wooden building with thick wooden beams and smoke curling lazily from the chimney. The door swings open and a blast of warm, humid air greets you, along with the unmistakable sound of laughter, splashing, and slapping. You step inside. Candlelight flickers along the misted walls, casting distorted shadows of bodies both clothed and not so clothed. The heat wraps around you like a wet towel. Men and women bathe together, sometimes in separate sections, sometimes not, depending on the town, the culture, or the bribe. It's steamy, loud, alive. This is a medieval public bathhouse, and for a time, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, these were incredibly popular. Most towns had at least one, and some had entire bathing districts. People came here to relax, to scrub away the week's grime, and yes, to chat. The bathhouse was a social hub, like a gym, a cafe, and a dating app all rolled into one very sweaty wooden building. But as you might expect, hygiene wasn't always the main goal dot in many places. Bathhouses had a reputation. Privacy was limited, clothing optional, and let's just say there was more than one kind of body heat involved. Church authorities frowned on them, of course, but even bishops occasionally showed up, towel in hand. Scandals were whispered behind fans. In some cities, brothels and bathhouses were so intertwined that the words became nearly interchangeable. Still, there was some effort toward cleanliness. People brought their own towels and soaps. They used a kind of lye-based cleanser made from ashes and fat, gritty, stinging, but effective. Others preferred scrubbing with coarse cloths or sand. In fancier places, attendants would massage bathers with fragrant oils and rinse them with buckets of warm water. It wasn't luxurious by modern standards, but in a world of chamber pots and crusty undergarments, this was heaven. You sit down on a bench, careful not to touch anything that looks too slippery, and watch as a young woman brushes her hair with a comb carved from bone. Her skin is flushed from the heat, and she hums softly to herself, lost in the haze. A child nearby splashes water at his father, who playfully growls and lifts him out of the tub like a sack of flour. For a moment, you forget how dirty the world outside is, but of course, nothing lasts forever. You hear someone whisper about the fever going around. Others mutter about the smell of illness rising from certain rooms. As time passed and plagues swept through Europe, the bathhouse began to fall out of favor. Public washing was seen as risky. People began to believe that hot water opened the pores, letting in bad air or miasma. Better to stay dry and dusty than risk death by bath. Here's a curious twist. In some places, bathhouses were blamed directly for the spread of disease. Cities like Paris and London shut them down during plague years. Doctors advised against frequent bathing. Dirt, they claimed, forms a protective barrier. Imagine your doctor today telling you to avoid soap and water for your health. Yet even then, bathing didn't vanish entirely. The wealthy could still afford private tubs, big wooden barrels lined with linen, filled bucket by bucket with warm water, a luxury reserved for lords and ladies, and only on special occasions. Meanwhile, peasants might wash in rivers or streams, if they lived near one, or simply wipe down with damp cloths in front of the hearth. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. You shift on the bench and notice something curious on the wall. An old poster, hand-painted and yellowed. With steam, it lists the prices for different services: soap, towel, water warming, even personal washing assistance. That last one is suspiciously vague. A man in a thick apron walks by, carrying a steaming bucket of water. He nods at you. You want a rinse? He asks. You decline. Politely. You've seen enough. Besides, you've got questions, and not just about what's floating in that tub. Like, why did people stop valuing the bathhouse? Was it really just fear of disease? Or was there something deeper, something cultural? Historians argue both sides. Some say the decline was driven by outbreaks of syphilis and other illnesses linked to close contact. Others say it was moral panic fueled by the church, by changing notions of modesty, by the growing idea that cleanliness of the soul mattered more than cleanliness of the skin. Either way, the bathhouse became suspect, suspended between sin and sanitation. It slowly disappeared from everyday life. But for a few centuries, it was the closest thing medieval towns had to wellness, a place to soak, to gossip, to scrub and steam, and forget the stench outside. You step back into the street, skin damp from the humidity, and the cold night air slaps your face. The bathhouse door swings shut behind you, and with it, that brief illusion of cleanliness. Outside, the world smells stronger now, as if your senses have been sharpened. You hear a dog barking again, a cart rattling over stones. Somewhere, someone is singing a low, off-key tune, and above it all, the slow drip of water from a gutter, black, thick, unidentifiable. You're beginning to realize something important. The medieval world didn't lack hygiene because they wanted to be dirty. They lacked it because they didn't have the systems, the tools, the knowledge, and in the absence of all that, They found ways to cope, imperfect, improvised, sometimes illogical, but still human. And you keep walking, past flickering torches, past the sound of horses in their stalls, past a man digging a trench with a flat, resigned expression on his face. Maybe tomorrow he'll fill it with something worse. But for now, the moon is rising, and you feel the warmth of the bathhouse still clinging to your skin like a memory, fading fast. Your footsteps echo softly now as the town grows quieter. The candles in the windows flicker like tired eyes, and the streets feel less chaotic, more resigned to their dirt. You turn a corner and nearly run straight into a man wearing a finely embroidered tunic. His shoes are soft leather, his belt is gilded, and his hair, well, it's trying its best to be majestic. This is a nobleman, a man of wealth, privilege, and lice. Don't let the elegance fool you. You're about to learn the filthy truth about medieval nobility. They weren't much cleaner than the common folk. In fact, in some ways, they were worse. Why? Because when you're rich and powerful, you don't have to wash. You just make other people deal with the consequences. You follow him from a safe distance, partly out of curiosity, partly out of a very real fear of catching something, and soon find yourself inside the stone courtyard of a manor house. The guards barely glance at you. Apparently, you don't look threatening, just damp and confused. Inside, everything is dim but decorated. Tapestries, velvet cushions, a roaring fire. The air smells of wax, meat stew, and something faintly metallic. The nobleman settles into a tall-backed chair as a servant removes his boots. He stretches his legs. The sound of scratching begins almost immediately. From under a table, another servant appears with a fine-toothed comb. It's bone-handled, delicate, beautiful, and it's about to be dragged through the man's oiled hair to collect lice. That's the real evening ritual here, not skincare, not meditation, lice control. In fact, lice were so common that people rarely commented on them. Everyone had them. You, your spouse, the bishop, even the king. Combs were a daily necessity, and delousing was an act of both grooming and social bonding. Imagine inviting someone over not for Netflix, but for a casual lice-picking session. But if lice were the roommates, fleas were the party crashers. Noble homes, with their animal skin rugs and thick feather beds, were perfect breeding grounds. Add in a roaring fireplace and poor ventilation, and you've got the medieval equivalent of a five-star flea resort. You're ushered quietly through a side corridor into the Lord's private chamber. It's grand, in a cold sort of way. A heavy canopy bed looms in the corner, covered in blankets that haven't been washed in months, maybe longer. Laundry was rare in noble circles, not because they didn't care, but because washing fine fabrics was labor-intensive and risky. Soap could ruin the color. Heat could shrink the wool. Better to leave things be. And yet, paradoxically, these lords and ladies cared deeply about appearances, smell included. That's where perfume came. In buckets of it, rose water, lavender, jasmine, and civet, a musky oil extracted from the glands of a wild cat. Delightful. They didn't bathe often, but they sure knew how to cover it up. Wealthy women would carry small pomanders, tiny, ornate balls filled with herbs or scented wax to hold near their noses. Men doused their gloves in citrus oil. Guests might be offered sweet-smelling hand towels upon arrival, more for the nostrils than the fingers. And then there were the clothes, layers upon layers. Linen undergarments sometimes, followed by woolen or silk tunics, cloaks, and hoods. All of it designed to trap warmth and smell. Once dressed, a noble might remain in the same outfit for days. Changing clothes wasn't about hygiene, it was about occasion. You didn't switch tunics because it was dirty. You switched because it was Tuesday. Still, personal servants played a huge role in minimizing visible filth. They brushed the hair. They rubbed scented powders under the arms. They held scented cloths under their lord's nose during long ceremonies, or especially pungent processions, because nothing says power like a man being escorted through his own odor. But it wasn't all perfume and powder. Some nobles genuinely did try to stay clean by their standards, at least. A few rare estates had private wooden tubs hauled out and filled manually on special occasions. A noble might be scrubbed down by servants using cloths and herbal infusions. think spa day. But less eucalyptus and more thyme and vinegar, interestingly. Many nobles believed that too much bathing was dangerous. As mentioned before, hot water opened the pores, which supposedly let disease in. Doctors even warned against washing the whole body at once. Better to just wipe the face and hands with a damp cloth and call it a day. Self-care medieval style. There's a book, centuries old, that recommends this charming beauty tip to freshen the breath. Boil fennel and mint in goat's milk, gargle it, and don't swallow. Seems simple until you realize goat's milk spoils fast and refrigeration wasn't exactly a thing. And here's a detail that might ruin your sleep, but not too much. I hope nobles often kept chamber pots in their rooms and didn't always empty them immediately, sometimes for days. The smell, ignored. Or maybe they just got used to it. Either way, it was considered normal. Comfort, apparently, has a flexible definition. Historians continue to argue over just how unhygienic the medieval elite were. Some suggest they were cleaner than we think, just differently clean. Others insist that behind the silk and satin was a very fragrant reality. The truth, probably somewhere in between. After all, how clean can you be when your castle moat doubles as your toilet? You take one last look around the nobleman's room. He's now fast asleep, snoring softly. Lice comb still on the bedside table. A dog curls up at the foot of the bed, fleas and all. The candle gutters in the corner, and you quietly slip out. Back into the hallway, back toward the murmur of servants. Back toward a world where class divides didn't mean freedom from filth, just different ways of managing it. You descend a narrow stone stairwell, the torchlight flickering along the damp walls. And you can't help but think, in some ways, it's not that different from today. We still spend fortunes covering smells, avoiding dirt, and inventing ways to pretend we're cleaner than we are. Only now, thankfully, we have plumbing. You step out into the night again, and the cool air hits your face like a wet rag that's seen better days. It's refreshing if you ignore the scent of manure, fish, and whatever that is coming from the alley to your left. But you're not here to breathe easy. You're here to uncover the ways people tried to stay clean without using water. Because believe it or not, in many parts of medieval Europe, water wasn't always considered your friend. In fact, it was sometimes seen as downright suspicious. You make your way toward a small market square. The stalls are shut, the vendors long gone, but a few barrels and crates remain mostly empty. Though one smells distinctly of rosemary and lavender, it's not food, it's dry bathing supplies. Yes, you heard that right. Dry bathing. Before showers and sinks, people got creative. Instead of scrubbing with water, they often dusted themselves clean, sort of. Powders made from ground herbs, chalk, or even crushed bones were used to absorb sweat and cover body odor. Think medieval dry shampoo just for your whole body, and slightly more crumbly. You pick up a pouch left behind on one of the crates. The label, in faded ink, reads herbal body freshener with clove, sage, and fine ash. You give it a cautious sniff. It's earthy, sharp, not unpleasant, and probably marginally more effective than just standing in a puddle, hoping for the best. This was the reality for many people, especially during colder months when water was scarce or frozen. Bathing in rivers was seasonal, indoor baths were rare, but body odor, that was year-round. So what did people do? They turned to oils and perfumes. You wander past an apothecary's window, the glass cloudy with age. Inside, shelves are lined with tiny vials, each containing some long-forgotten tincture, rosewater, bay oil, vinegar infused with herbs. These were used to dab behind the ears, under the arms, even in the shoes, not to remove the dirt, mind you, just to distract from it. And then there were the truly questionable techniques. You might want to sit down. For this one, some recipes for cleanliness included things like boiling moss with vinegar, then rubbing it onto the body. Others called for applying mixtures of butter, crushed leaves, and goat's milk. If it sounds like a salad dressing, it probably was, at least briefly, before it went rancid. You pass a small home with its shutters ajar. Inside, a woman is brushing her long, dark hair by candlelight. No water in sight, just a bone comb and a small pouch of scented powder. She sprinkles it along her scalp, works it in with her fingers, then begins brushing it through until the powder is mostly absorbed. For many women, hair care was hygiene. If your hair looked clean and smelled vaguely of lavender, it didn't matter that your feet hadn't seen soap in weeks. It was all about presentation. And here's something few people know. Hair washing wasn't necessarily avoided, but it was rare. Some washed it monthly. Others used oils to coat the hair and keep it from drying out between washes. For those with money, wigs were a solution, though they came with their own problems, namely lice, and the horrifying practice of powdering them with flour or starch, which could attract mice if you weren't careful. Yes, mice, in your hair. Meanwhile, the poor had simpler techniques. A cloth soaked in warm vinegar could be used to wipe down the body. Soap, if available, was made from animal fat and would ash harsh on the skin, but effective. People also burned certain herbs in their homes and even under their clothes to cleanse the air around the body. Think of it as medieval body spray, just with more smoke inhalation. You crouch by an old public fountain. The basin is mostly dry now, the water line low and murky. But once, this would have been a gathering spot for washing hands, rinsing vegetables, and maybe even wiping off your boots. Not bathing, though. That was rarely done in public view unless you were a child, or very drunk, or simply didn't care. In some places, public fountains were the only access to running water. But access didn't mean trust. Many feared that water carried disease. And to be fair, it often did. Wells were shallow, streams ran near latrines, and rain barrels bred mosquitoes. So unless the water was boiled, it wasn't necessarily safer then. It makes you think, doesn't it? In a time when water was unreliable, people had to develop a different relationship with cleanliness, one based more on smell, texture, and social cues than scientific sanitation. If you didn't look or smell obviously disgusting, you were probably considered clean enough. And that threshold, it was very forgiving. But before you judge too harshly, think about the alternatives. Imagine having no plumbing, no soap, no heater, no washer or dryer, no toothbrush, no Febreze, no anything. Wouldn't you start carrying scented herbs in your sleeves too still? Not all medieval people were resigned to the grime. Some wrote poems about the joys of washing. Others painted saints standing in rivers, as if holiness and hygiene were spiritually linked. Even certain monks bathed weekly, though always with caution and prayer, just in case the devil was hiding in the steam. Of course, scholars still debate the meaning of all this. Some claim that medieval hygiene gets exaggerated, that people weren't as dirty as we think. Others argue we underestimate the stench. Was it as bad as they say? Or are we just spoiled by hot showers and minty toothpaste? Whatever the answer, you glance down at your own hands covered in medieval dust, dried herb flakes, and something that might be vinegar, and you understand this much. Clean, back then, was relative. And survival, that was always the top priority. You stand, brush yourself off, and continue walking, past shuttered doors, past a cart with wilted herbs, past a tavern window, where someone inside is clearly too drunk to care about hygiene at all. The night grows darker, and the air grows still, but you know this town is far from clean, and somehow, that makes it all the more alive. You move through the quiet streets now with a strange sort of confidence, like you've earned your grime. Like every bit of dirt on your boots is a badge of historical understanding. But tonight's tour isn't done. There's still one very tangled and very greasy topic we haven't touched yet. Hair. Specifically, medieval hair. And hats, and how the two work together in a long, sweaty alliance of practicality, vanity, and let's be honest, odor control. You find yourself drawn toward the glow of a weaving shop. The looms are still now, the workers long gone, but a few hats hang in the window, tall, wide-brimmed felt hats, pointy woolen caps, and even a circlet of twisted linen meant to keep hair off the neck. You reach out and run a finger along the brim of one. It's stiff with age and something else, wax, maybe, or decades of scalp. Because here's the thing, most people wore hats nearly all the time, indoors, outdoors, sleeping, praying, traveling, you name it. Hats weren't just fashion, they were part of the hygiene routine, or, perhaps more accurately, the hygiene illusion. You peek through the shop's open side door and spot a small stool, a half-empty bowl of oil, and a comb lying nearby. Someone's been doing their evening hair prep. You recognize the smell now: rosemary and goose fat, stirred into a paste, a classic medieval hair treatment used for shine, scalp care, and sometimes just for the hope of deterring lice. Spoiler: it didn't work. Let's break it down. For both men and women, hair was a symbol of status, of health, even of morality. A woman's long, well-kept hair was seen as beautiful, even holy. But letting it hang loose in public, scandalous. Covered hair was modest hair. That's why married women often wore wimples, veils, or headdresses. You didn't flaunt your clean hair. You kept it hidden and let people assume. And those who couldn't hide their hygiene, they got creative. Dry combing was the most common daily ritual. You'd sit by the hearth, heat a comb, bone or wood, usually, and slowly drag it through your scalp to loosen flakes and dislodge lice. People often combed their hair over a white cloth, not to admire their locks, but to count the bodies. If you were lucky, you only saw one or two wriggling shapes. If you were unlucky, well, let's not dwell. Men weren't exempt. A nobleman's flowing locks or a merchant's neat beard were marks of dignity. But grooming took time and tools. Beard oils, mustache waxes, and scented balms made from crushed herbs were part of a medieval gentleman's kit. If you think modern hipsters invented beard care, think again. Still, water rarely touched the scalp. Shampoo, as we know it, didn't exist. Instead, people used egg yolk, vinegar rinses, or ash mixed with water. Some rubbed fuller's earth, a kind of clay, into the hair, then brushed it out once dry to remove grease. Imagine dry shampoo, but earthier. Literally. You wander further, stopping outside a home where an elderly woman sits in the doorway, gently combing her granddaughter's hair by candlelight. Her fingers are deft, practiced. She parts the hair with a carved stick and dabs something onto the child's scalp, probably vinegar, maybe garlic juice. Old remedies for lice. Some even swore by crushed mint leaves or brace yourself boiled onion water. As the woman hums softly, you watch her tuck the child's hair beneath a linen coif. It's simple, but effective. Keeps the hair neat, keeps the lice in, too. But that's tomorrow's problem. You move on. And now, you start noticing hats everywhere. A felt cap hanging from a fence post. A straw hat abandoned beside a market stall. A velvet chaperone hanging from a noble's bedpost. Hats weren't just protection from the sun or cold, they were a social signal. Like your hairstyle. Today, your hat said who you were. A wide hood might mean a monk. A beaded veil meant you were married. A feathered cap, you were probably trying to hard. And underneath all of it was hair. Hair that hadn't seen water in weeks. Hair that was perfumed, powdered, and pinned but rarely rinsed. Even in the church, hair was regulated. Monks had their heads shaved into the classic tonsure, a bald circle surrounded by hair like a halo of humility. It wasn't about cleanliness, it was about obedience. But it also had the side effect of limiting lice infestations to one ring instead of the whole head. A win-win, perhaps. Historians still puzzle over just how often people actually washed their hair. Some sources suggest weekly, others say seasonally. Maybe it depended on your status, your gender, or your tolerance for smelling like boiled herbs and poultry fat. But here's a surprise. Some medieval doctors believed dirty hair was healthier. They claimed too much washing caused headaches or weakened the brain. Better to let the natural oils coat the scalp. Medieval science brought to you by itchy foreheads everywhere. And yet, despite all this, people cared. They styled, they braided, they adorned their hair with ribbons, beads, and pins. They painted it with henna. They plucked their hairlines to achieve fashionable high foreheads. Hygiene may have been questionable, but vanity, oh, vanity was alive and well. So you walk on, your feet silent against the cobblestones, and you wonder if someone from the future visited your bathroom shelf, your bottles, your sprays, your gadgets. Would they think you're filthy for needing so much? After all, to a medieval mind, you might seem overly obsessed. Why wash hair so often? Why remove all the body's oils? Isn't that unnatural? Maybe, just maybe, we're all a little bit weird when it comes to hygiene. We just do it in different styles and with fewer lice. A breeze stirs your cloak. A bell rings in the distance. Somewhere, someone sneezes, and you, gently adjusting your imaginary hat, continue walking. The stars begin to peek through the clouds above as your steps lead you away from the noise of town and towards something quieter, older. The buildings thin out. The air grows cooler. You pass under a stone archway and find yourself staring up at thick wooden doors banded in iron. A monastery. You push gently, and they creak open. Inside, it's nearly silent. Just the gentle patter of sandals on stone, the faint rustle of robes. The scent of beeswax and herbs hangs in the air, lavender, maybe, or thyme. A monk passes you, eyes downcast, hands clasped, walking with the slow rhythm of someone who has long since given up on rushing. You've entered a world where hygiene and holiness are more closely linked than you'd expect. See, while townspeople and nobles fumbled their way through the grime, monks and nuns actually had something resembling a hygiene routine, not because they were obsessed with cleanliness, but because they saw it as part of their spiritual discipline. The rule of St. Benedict, sort of a lifestyle guide. For monastic living, actually recommended regular washing, especially of the hands and feet. Yes, feet. Monasteries often had scheduled foot washing rituals, not only to sooths or travelers or weary brothers, but as a symbol of humility. You'd kneel before your fellow monk, pour warm water over his feet, dry them with a cloth, and maybe even anoint them with oil. Imagine that level of trust in a time without nail clippers or athlete's foot spray. You follow a narrow corridor lit by flickering torches and arrive at a small stone room. The lavatorium, the washroom, not to be confused with the latrine that's further out. This was for cleansing. There's a long trough running along one wall, with small spouts carved into the stone like little mouths. A monk stands there now, splashing water on his face with practiced motion. The water comes from a carefully maintained aqueduct system, one of the monastery's prides. Unlike the townsfolk outside who dumped waste in the streets, monasteries often built latrines with running water, emptying into streams or cesspits far from the main living quarters. It wasn't perfect, but it was intentional and, in some places, even innovative. Some monks were trained in medicine. They used herbs and poultices, knew how to distill oils, and even recorded health observations in manuscripts. One old book now preserved in a dusty library somewhere includes a recipe for a cleansing tonic made of rosemary boiled in wine. Sounds like a medieval spa treatment until you realize it was meant to be drunk to flush the humors. You pass into the scriptorium, where a few monks are copying texts by candlelight. Their fingers are ink-stained, but their robes are tidy, their hair neatly tonsured. Even here, where the work is silent and sacred, there's a quiet rhythm of care, wiping hands, adjusting sleeves, breathing evenly to keep the candle flame steady. They pause to stretch, to sip water, to clean their quills. Hygiene here isn't just physical, it's mental. A clean mind and a clean body, or at least clean enough. But of course, this wasn't universal. Some monasteries were poor, understaffed, or overwhelmed by visitors. Some lacked proper water supplies, and some monks, well, they skipped a few steps. There are accounts of cloisters where rats roamed freely, where lice infested the dormitories, and where chamber pots were dumped just beyond the garden wall. As always, it depended on where you were and how well your abbot enforced the rules. You wander out into the cloister garden. Moonlight illuminates neat rows of herbs: sage, mint, yarrow, chamomile, each with its purpose: for bathing, for scenting linens, for fighting infection. Some monks carried small pouches of herbs to sniff during prayer, believing the fragrance cleared the mind and kept disease at bay. And then there's the laundry. You might be surprised to learn that monastic garments were often washed more regularly than the average peasant's tunic. Some orders had strict rules: one robe, washed weekly. Others had to alternate. It wasn't luxury, it was routine. Of course, washing could mean different things. Sometimes just a rinse in cold water, sometimes a quick scrub with soap made from animal fat and wood ash. Soap, by the way, was often made by the monks themselves. The process was smelly, tedious, and dangerous, but it produced something vaguely effective. If you didn't mind smelling like old bacon. As you lean against the stone wall, you begin to notice something calming about this place. The silence, the order, the deliberate pace. It's not sterile by any means, but there's a method here, a kind of harmony. Dirt still exists, but it's managed. And in a world without microscopes, antiseptics, or hand sanitizer, that was no small thing. Still, even monasteries had their limits. During the Black Death, many religious communities were wiped out entirely. Their gardens overrun, their baths abandoned, their neat routines swallowed by panic. Because no matter how clean your robes or how sweet your herbal pouch, plague didn't care. Even now, historians debate just how effective monastic hygiene really was. Did it prevent illness, or just make life more tolerable? Some say the rituals were spiritual, not sanitary. Others believe they had unintended health benefits. Either way, monastic life left a trace, proof that, even in the filthiest of centuries, someone tried. And maybe that's what hygiene meant back then, not perfection, but intention. Doing what you could, with what little you had, to keep the world from sinking too far into decay. You stand beneath the arch once more, the cool wind stirring your cloak. Behind you, the monastery hums softly, its candles, its ink pots, its baths and basins and basilisks of soap. Ahead, the town waits. You step back into the dark. The warmth of the monastery fades behind you. As you return to the town's winding arteries, narrow alleys, uneven cobbles, and the occasional puddle you'd rather not step in, your boots are beginning to soak through. You've stopped wondering what's in the water. Ahead, the market square is quieter now, almost peaceful. You pause near a butcher's stall, empty, but still fragrant, not in the good way. A slab of something unidentifiable hangs from a hook, stiff with age, and beneath the counter, flies. Always the flies. Tonight, you've reached one of the more charming corners of the medieval hygiene puzzle. Public spaces and professions. The kind of jobs where cleanliness wasn't optional but still somehow avoided. You skirt around a half-collapsed barrel and spot a man squatting by the roadside, cleaning something with what looks like a rag. But it's not a rag, it's a woolen glove. And what he's cleaning is teeth. You've stumbled upon a barber-surgeon. Now, don't let the name fool you. These guys were part barber, part bloodletter, part dentist, part amateur therapist, and occasionally part gravedigger. They did a little of everything, and most of it without washing their hands. You watch as he leans in, presses a knee against a young man's shoulder, and yanks. There's a sickening pop, a yell, and then applause from a nearby drunk. The tooth blackened and cracked is triumphantly tossed into a tin bowl. No gloves, no antiseptic, just a pair of rusty iron tongs and a strong stomach. You'd think a profession involving that much blood and breath would demand some serious hygiene protocols. But no, the barber wipes his hands on his apron, rinses the tongs in a bowl of vaguely red water, and gestures for the next patient. If you're wondering where toothbrushes fit into all this, they didn't. Not really. The medieval world had tooth cleaning customs. Sure, but no brushes like we know them. People used chew sticks, rubbed their teeth with cloth, or even used crushed salt and charcoal. A few wealthy folks had brushes imported from the East, made of horsehair or hog bristle, but those were rare and mostly decorative. Instead, many swore by herbal powders. Think crushed sage, mint, or even burned rosemary. Some used vinegar rinses. Others chewed fennel seeds after meals to freshen their breath. One recipe suggested a paste made from honey and ground oyster shells. Tasty. But again, this was mostly about presentation. No one was flossing. No one was scraping plaque. And absolutely no one was checking for cavities unless they screamed. You cross the square and spot a woman dumping out a bucket into a gutter. The contents splash into the street, swirl briefly round your foot, and continue toward a nearby stream. The smell is impressive. She shrugs at you. Better than yesterday, she says, and disappears inside. This, of course, is the medieval sewer system, also known as gravity. Waste flowed downhill, sometimes through purpose-built trenches, sometimes just between houses. Some towns had cesspits. Others relied on privies over running water. But for most, disposal meant dumping things wherever they'd flow away fast to stand praying it rains soon. And then there were the gong farmers. Yes, That was their actual job title. You'd think it's a joke, but no, these were the brave souls who climbed into pits full of human waste, scooped it out by hand, and hauled it outside the town walls, usually at night, to spare the public and their own pride. They were paid well, relatively speaking, but they weren't exactly invited to dinner parties. The smell, legendary. The risk, massive. Many died from the fumes or infections. Others went blind. Some towns even had laws restricting how close they could live to the city center. And yet, without them, everything would collapse into filth literally. You pass another shop, a baker's. Inside, the hearth still glows faintly, and the scent of bread lingers under layers of smoke and sweat. Bakers were required to scrub their floors sometimes daily, but not because of sanitation. Because rats loved flour. Food preparation had its own hygiene logic, not necessarily based on germs which no one understood, but on visible dirt, foul, smells, and tradition. Butchers washed their knives only when they looked rusty. Fishmongers threw salt over their counters. Cooks wiped their hands on their aprons and called it good. Was it enough? Sometimes. Sometimes not. One infamous case in a medieval city involved bread made with water from a polluted well, resulting in dozens falling ill. Another story tells of a town banning the sale of fish in warm weather because no one could guarantee freshness, and the stench was unbearable. Still, people adapted. Markets had rules barely enforced, but still rules. Food had to be weighed fairly. Rotten produce was supposed to be removed. Bakers caught cheating on loaf size could be tied to a cart and paraded through town, their bread hanging from their necks. Cleanliness wasn't science, it was shame. And speaking of shame, a beggar shuffles past you now, coughing into his sleeve. His clothes are tattered, his hands black with grime. But as he passes a priest on the steps of a nearby church, he bows, and the priest blesses him, fingers brushing his head. No disgust, no distance. Because in this world, dirt didn't always mean disgrace. Sometimes it meant suffering. And suffering, too many, meant closeness to the divine. Historians argue about how health and poverty were understood in the Middle Ages. Some say filth was seen as punishment for sin. Others argue that the poor were pitied, not scorned. The truth, likely both. People feared illness, but they also respected those who endured it. You take one last look at the square. The butcher's hook, the barber's bowl, the baker's soot-streaked oven, all part of a system, chaotic and crude, but somehow functional. And you keep walking, ears full of whispers, nostrils full of history, and just enough skepticism to make you grateful for modern soap. The town fades into shadows behind you as you take a narrow path lined with hedges, crumbling stone walls, and the occasional rat making bold eye contact. You've seen the hair, the hats, the bloodletting barbers, and their bucket of horror. But now it's time to get personal, uncomfortably personal. Tonight, you find yourself wandering toward a small laundry yard tucked behind a cluster of cottages. There's a fire pit, a few wooden tubs, and a heavy scent of urine in the air. No one's here now, but the traces remain. Piles of damp linen, a half-empty bucket of lye, and what looks suspiciously like someone's undergarments hung over a fence. Let's talk about medieval underwear, or rather, the questionable existence of it. You see, while upper-class fashion of the time involved layers of linen, wool, and occasionally silk, the lower layers, those closest to the skin, were rarely mentioned in detail, which has left historians debating for centuries. Did medieval people really wear underwear? The short answer, yes, sort of. Men often wore a garment called braise, baggy linen shorts tied at the waist with a drawstring. Imagine a diaper crossed with boxer shorts. These were worn under tunics and hose. And like modern underwear, they were designed to be washable, breathable, and modest. Mostly women. Their options were a little murkier. There's little surviving evidence of female undergarments in the early medieval period. Some may have gone without, especially among the poor. Others wore long linen shifts like a nightgown that served as both underlayer and sleepwear. But regardless of what they wore or didn't, laundry was a nightmare. You crouch beside one of the wash tubs. The lye inside is thick, chalky, and smells like it could dissolve time itself. Medieval soap wasn't gentle. It was made from animal fat, wood ash, and urine. Yes, urine. Human pee was collected sometimes from public receptacles and used as an ammonia-rich cleanser. So when it came time to wash your braise, it wasn't a cozy bubble bath. It was more like chemical warfare. Soaking, boiling, beating with wooden paddles, then laying everything out in the sun to bleach if there was sun that day. And let's be clear, this wasn't a daily ritual. Most people changed their underclothes once a week if they were lucky. Some only for feast days or holidays. The shift or braise would absorb sweat, oils, and everything else until it couldn't anymore. Then it was time for a scrub. You look at a pair now, simple, stitched linen, worn thin at the seams. Someone wore these for months, perhaps, before giving them a wash. Maybe they were a servant, or a soldier, or a farmer too busy surviving to care about the smell. And speaking of soldiers, traveling, fighting, working in the fields, you probably didn't change clothes at all. A knight might go days or weeks without removing his chainmail, much less his underwear. When he did peel off the layers, what lay beneath was not for the faint of heart. Chafing, sores, infections, lice, possibly a squirrel. Who's to say? Even peasants who theoretically had access to rivers and streams didn't always wash. Water was often needed for cooking, not cleaning. And in winter, forget it. Freezing temperatures meant frozen fingers, frozen laundry, and frozen, well, everything. You rise and walk toward a patch of tall grass behind the cottages. Here you spot a wooden bench with holes cut into it, a primitive latrine. There's a bucket nearby with ash inside. No toilet paper, of course. Instead, people wiped with leaves, straw, moss, or rags. If you were lucky, you had a communal sponge on a stick, kept in a bucket of vinegar. Romantic, right? But worse than the wiping were the unwanted guests. You scratch your arm just thinking about it. Lice, fleas, and mites weren't just part of life, they were part of clothing. Clothes were rarely laundered and even more rarely boiled, which was the only surefire way to kill pests. And yes, people knew they had them. They even had nicknames for lice: seam sprites, body fleas, or in one part of Europe, the little gray monks, cute in a horrifying way. One scholar wrote that people used to shake out their shifts each morning to greet their gray companions. Others believed lice were part of God's design to remind humans of their sinful flesh. Can't argue with that level of spiritual coping, but they did try to fight back. People stored undergarments with lavender, rosemary, and rue to repel insects. They sewed herbs into their seams, stuffed garlic into their collars, and dusted ashes or chalk into their bed sheets. Some even ironed their underclothes, not for style, but to burn the eggs of lice and fleas. It sort of worked. Sometimes you pass a cottage window where a young boy is scratching furiously at his neck while his mother searches his collar with a grim look. She finds something, pinches it, and tosses it into the fire. Just another Tuesday. So, were medieval people gross or just victims of their technology? Well, both. But remember, to them, this was normal. They didn't walk around thinking, I'm disgusting. They thought, I'm surviving. And when your world is full of war, famine, plague, and the occasional marauding boar, changing your underpants probably didn't crack the top 10. And yet, some did care. Some washed weekly. Some boiled their linens. Some, wealthy or unusually fastidious, bathed often and changed regularly. These people were whispered about, admired, or considered odd. Cleanliness in the Middle Ages was a luxury, a statement, a defiance against filth. You glance once more at the drying line. The linen sways gently in the wind. Moonlight catches the folds, the stitches, the stains. It's humble, it's worn, it's profoundly human, and with that, you move on. The night deepens, but your curiosity, like medieval dirt, lingers stubbornly. You leave behind the backyards, the undergarments, and the vinegar-scented laundry, and turn toward something strangely civilized. A warm orange glow flickers. In the distance, not a hearth this time, not a candle in a window, but steam rising from behind stone walls, curling like fog. You follow the scent of burning wood and herbs until it hits you. You found a medieval bathhouse. Yes, they existed. In fact, for a while, they were extremely popular, especially in urban centers across Europe. From London to Lübeck, public bathhouses were common gathering places. And no, they weren't all scandalous or sinful, though, depending on the town, the hour, and who you asked, they could be all of the above. You push open a creaky wooden gate and enter a courtyard of mist and murmurs. The bathhouse itself is a modest timber structure with smoke curling from its roof vents. Through an open window, you glimpse candlelight reflecting off wet skin, the low drone of voices, the clink of ceramic cups. Inside, things are, surprisingly, serene. The room is dim, the air heavy with steam and rosemary. There are wooden tubs of varying sizes, some big enough for couples or small groups. People soak in hot water, lean against stone edges, chat quietly. An attendant leaves rolled pours more heated water into a tub. Another carries in a bucket of cold to temper the heat. This is a bathhouse for ordinary people. A laborer might come here once a week, a merchant after market day. Some used it for hygiene, others for gossip, for business deals, for flirting. Yes, flirting. Because public bathing wasn't always segregated. In many places, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries, men and women bathed together, nude or semi-nude. It sounds scandalous to modern ears, but in many medieval towns, this was simply part of life, a chance to be clean, relaxed, and maybe enjoy a mug of ale while you soaked. In fact, bathhouses often doubled as taverns. You'd bathe, then eat, or eat while you bathed. Stew in one tub, stew in another. The parallels were unavoidable, and yet despite the merriment, people took it seriously. Bathhouse staff, called stewards or keepers, had rules. Tubs were drained and scrubbed regularly. Herbs were added to the water not just for scent, but believed medicinal benefits. Think sage for muscle aches, chamomile for nerves, fennel for digestion. There were tools, too, scrapers, called strigils, used to remove sweat and oil, linen cloths for rubbing down, even wooden sandals to protect your feet from the hot stone floors. Some bathers wore caps to keep their hair dry, or to protect against bad vapors rising from the water. You watch as an older man steps from a tub, wraps a cloth around his waist, and sits by a brazier to cool off. Another man follows, lighting a pipe. They nod to each other, companions in this temporary moment of warmth and cleanliness. But as you're admiring the civility of it all, a loud splash interrupts the calm. A group of younger bathers are being decidedly less reserved, laughing, play fighting, maybe a little tipsy. A steward shakes his head but doesn't intervene. You smile. It's a reminder, even in the Middle Ages, hygiene was social. And yet, not everyone approved. As bathhouses became more widespread, clergy began to frown. The church didn't mind cleanliness, per se, but it did mind nudity, and laughter, and mixed-gender soaking. In some places, bathhouses gained a reputation as places of vice. By the late 15th century, in many towns, they were being shut down, or heavily restricted. But before the moral panic, they were almost ritualistic. A full bathing session might go like this: disrobe in a changing room. Sit on a bench while an attendant scrubs your limbs with cloth and ash soap. Step into the hot tub for soaking. Rinse with clean water. Enjoy a light meal or drink. Rest near a hearth. Put on freshly aired clothes. Not bad for an era we assume was coated in filth, right? Of course, this wasn't universal. Rural areas had no bathhouses. Many people couldn't afford even the modest fee for entry, and during outbreaks of plague, bathhouses were viewed as dangerous. Steam was thought to open the pores, making you more vulnerable to bad air. So once again, the golden age of communal bathing faded. Many bathhouses were converted to other uses. Some became brothels, others storerooms. A few survived into the early modern period, only to be replaced by private washing as plumbing evolved. Or still, historians debate how common bathhouse use really was. Some say they were elite luxuries. Others argue they were a weekly staple for tradesmen and craftsmen. We may never know. The truth, as always, is slippery like wet stone underfoot. You move toward the door now, your skin damp from the heat in the room. Outside, the night air bites at your face. The sound of the city has faded into a sleepy hush. But somewhere nearby, someone is still scrubbing, still soaking, still trying, however briefly, to feel clean. And maybe that's the thread tying This altogether, the desire to feel, just for a moment, renewed, in a world of dirt, disease, and chaos, a little hot water and rosemary went a long way. You drift down a quieter path now, away from the bathhouses and bustle, toward the edge of town where the light dims, but the stories deepen. There's a small cottage ahead, its chimney puffing soft plumes of smoke into the star-flecked sky. The shutters are drawn. A muted groan carries into the night, followed by hushed whispers. Then a sudden sharp crickwick, primal. You've arrived just in time. A child is being born. In the medieval world, childbirth wasn't just a medical event, it was a social and spiritual one. And strangely enough, in this one sacred space, hygiene often took priority in ways that seem surprisingly modern, and in other ways, profoundly not. You step inside the dim cottage and find the birthing chamber. A single bed, layered in wool and linen, with a woman lying atop it, flushed and exhausted. Around her are 3 other women midwives, most likely moving. With quiet urgency, one holds a cloth to the mother's brow. Another adjusts the bolster beneath her knees. The third tends to a kettle of hot water near the hearth, dipping clean cloths into it. There's lavender in the air, mingled with salt, vinegar, and fear, because even on a good day, childbirth was dangerous. The chamber itself has been richly prepared. The windows are shut tight to keep out bad air. The fire burns constantly to warm the room and protect the womb. No men are allowed inside, not even the husband. Only women, mothers, aunts, neighbors, and of course, the midwife. She is the expert, not a doctor, but a guardian of birth traditions passed down through generations. She knows when to massage, when to wait, when to pray. Her tools, modest, but specific: linens, oil, scissors, herbal salves. Many carried small birthing kits, wrapped in oiled leather, and some wore charms, amulets believed to bring protection from evil spirits, miscarriage, or worse. But here's where it gets fascinating. Midwives cared deeply about cleanliness, as much as they understood it anyway. They washed their hands before touching the mother, sometimes in herb-infused water. They sterilized cutting tools in boiling water or fire. They cleaned bedding between deliveries. Compared to surgeons or barbers, midwives were meticulous. Why? Because they witnessed death constantly. They knew what infections looked like, what fevers followed unclean births, what wounds wouldn't heal. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that some kinds of dirt were deadly. And when the child finally arrives wet, crying, beautiful, and red, the midwife does not bathe it. Because here's the twist: newborns were not washed, not fully, at least. The belief was that the white coating, vernix caseosa, a waxy layer covering newborns, was holy. It was thought to be protective, even sacred. Washing it off was discouraged. Instead, the baby was wiped gently with warm cloths, often dipped in wine or herb water, but not scrubbed. No soap, no cold rinses, just warmth and gentle drying. Next came the binding. Infants were wrapped tightly in swaddling bands, keeping the limbs straight and warm. It was believed this helped bones grow properly and kept the child calm. But it also had a side effect. It reduced the need to bathe or clean the infant regularly. Swaddling could last all day, changed only when soiled. And what about the umbilical cord that was cut with a knife or scissors, cleaned beforehand, ideally, and tied with linen thread? Then the stump was dabbed with wine, vinegar, or powdered herbs to prevent bad humors. The stump fell off naturally within a week or so. After the birth, the midwife often stayed with the family for several days. She helped with feeding, comforted the mother, and monitored for signs of childbed fever, a postpartum infection that could claim a mother's life. In a matter of days, midwives, despite their skill, were not always respected. Some were honored. Others were accused of witchcraft, blamed when babies died, or scrutinized by church authorities. There were manuals written to guide midwives and to control them. In some towns, they had to be licensed. In others, they worked in secret. You glance now at the mother, cradling her newborn, both of them drifting toward sleep. The midwife hums a soft tune while she stirs a bowl of broth over the fire. The room smells of sweat and rosemary, a strange mix of love, pain, and care. Clean it is not, but tended to, absolutely. Hygiene. In this moment, is an act of protection, not polish, a ritual of care, passed from hands to hands. And yet, even here, nothing is guaranteed. Many infants didn't survive beyond the first year. Many mothers didn't survive the birth, but still they tried. They bathed, they wrapped, they whispered charms and boiled herbs and hoped. Historians still debate how much midwives knew. Did they understand cross-contamination? Likely not, but they learned from what worked. Clean hands meant fewer deaths, so they washed. And so, somehow, in this fragile, flickering moment, the dirtiest time in history gives you one of its cleanest truths. Hygiene was love, not perfect, not scientific, but deeply human. You close the door gently behind you and step back into the night. The sky has lightened just a touch, the first hint of dawn, and with it, a sense of quiet awe. You keep walking, carrying with you the scent of herbs, the hush of new life, and the echo of ancient hands doing their best. The air is thinner now, brushed with the pale gray of oncoming dawn. But the night isn't quite finished with you yet. You follow a cobbled path that twists gently uphill, toward the high quarters of the town. The buildings here grow taller, the wood beams straighter, the windows cleaner relatively speaking. Lanterns burn in wrought iron holders. A stone lion guards the entrance to a tall home with glass panes in the upper windows. You've entered noble territory. And while you might think nobility had it better when it came to hygiene, well, you're partially right. And partially very, very wrong. You pause before a carved oak door. It opens with a soft creak, revealing a richly appointed chamber, velvet cushions, tapestries on the walls, and an ornate wooden chest carved with angels and vines. Inside, a noblewoman sits before a small vanity table, not with blush or mascara, but with jars of powder, brushes of bone and ivory, and tiny glass vials. Tonight's story turns to cosmetics and medieval attempts at personal scent control, where beauty and cleanliness blurred into a strange, fragrant illusion. The woman dips her fingers into a small pot and smooths a pale mixture onto her cheeks. It's a paste made from lead white, mixed with vinegar or egg whites to create a smooth, powdered finish. It's supposed to make her look angelic porcelain, untouched by sun or labor. But you know better. That mask of cleanliness is toxic. Literally, many cosmetics used by the nobility contain poisonous materials: lead, mercury, arsenic. They didn't know the science, of course. They just knew it made the skin pale, the lashes dark, the lips vibrant. Beauty at any cost. And beauty mattered. Pale skin meant you didn't labor under the sun. It meant wealth, luxury, purity. A tan face, that was for peasants. So the upper class powdered themselves into ghostly perfection and did everything they could to avoid sweating, smelling, or appearing human. Perfumes were essential. The noblewoman opens a vial now and dabs it behind her ears. You catch a scent: rosewater mixed with clove and bergamot. Exotic, expensive, imported in glass bottles or distilled by hand in copper stills. Perfume was used liberally on skin, hair, clothes, even on gloves and handkerchiefs. Some nobles wore pomanders, little metal balls filled with fragrant herbs, worn on a chain around the neck or waist to ward off bad air. Think of it as a medieval air freshener that you wore. Even clothing was perfumed. Garments might be stored with sachets of lavender or wormwood. Some were even soaked in rosewater before being worn for special occasions. Gloves scented with ambergris or musk were all the rage. Yes, that's the waxy stuff from inside whales. Don't ask. You peek toward the corner, where a maid tends to a copper basin. She pours in warm water, stirs in milk, honey, and crushed petals, then gestures toward the screen hiding the bath. Nobles did bathe more than peasants, certainly, but it was far from frequent. A noblewoman might take a bath once a week, if that, and even then, the bath was more ritual than routine. Water was scented, linens were heated, musicians might play softly in the background. And soap, if she used it, it was Castile soap, imported, and expensive, made from olive oil and sodium carbonate, creamy, fragrant, and vastly superior to the harsh gray bricks peasants used. Some made do with soapwort, an herb that lathered mildly and was gentler on the skin. But bathing, as always, had its enemies. Some doctors still warned that too much washing weakened the body, that it opened the pores to disease. so many nobles chose a safer route: wash only visible areas, and perfume the rest. It was called a dry bath, wiping the hands, face, and neck with scented cloths and powders, clean enough to impress, not enough to offend. You step into another room, this one darker, with oak-paneled walls and a small writing desk. A nobleman reclines in a chair while a valet brushes his hair. His boots are off. His feet rest in a basin of wine and rosemary. Foot washing was considered essential, especially after long rides, but full body washing, rare. Instead, nobles changed clothes often. They had the luxury of linen underlayers, clean, soft, absorbent, and simply swapped them out instead of scrubbing skin. The logic was, change the shirt, not the body. And when that didn't work, more perfume, more powder, more herbs stuffed into every possible pocket. Yet, despite all this effort, many nobles still stank, because no matter how many rose petals you soaked in, if you didn't clean your hair, your breath, your armpits, or your other bits, eventually nature wins. One chronicler wrote of a queen who entered a room, like a garden in bloom, but left behind a scent that lingered, though not as sweet. Still, some aristocrats did try harder. Royal courts in places like France, Italy, and Moorish Spain had a more advanced sense of hygiene. Islamic influence brought better bathing habits, refined perfumery, and a culture of washing before prayer. In fact, many of the best medieval hygiene practices came through cross-cultural exchange from the Middle East, North Africa, and the Byzantine Empire, places where baths were cleaner, more frequent, and less taboo. But Europe, it took its sweet-smelling time. So here you are, standing in a world where a good smell could hide a multitude of sins. And maybe that's what perfumes and powders were really about, not just hygiene, but hope. Hope that you could fake it just enough to pass, that a bit of lemon water or powdered iris root could hold back the tides of sweat and stink and mortality. Historians still debate whether these routines helped or harmed, whether the lead face paint caused more illness than it covered, whether perfume disguised rot or delayed it. But one thing is certain, even in the filthiest centuries, people longed to be beautiful, to be fragrant, to rise above the mud, if only by smell. You step out of the noble house now, the scent of rose and smoke clinging to your sleeves. The wind is colder, the sky a little bluer. Somewhere behind you, a rooster begins to crow, but there are still a few dark corners left to visit. You follow the path downhill now, boots pressing softly into damp earth. As the town gives way to silence once again, the cobbles thin out, replaced by packed soil. The air feels different, cooler, somehow heavier. Ahead rises the outline of a church framed by cypress trees and the fading stars. Its stone facade is weathered but imposing, etched with carvings of angels and beasts, saints and demons. A single candle glows from within, and just beyond the great wooden doors, a bell tolls softly. You've arrived at the next chapter in this story of grime and grace, the sacred hygiene of the medieval church. Now, you might think the house of God would be one of the cleaner corners of this world, but the truth, like a poorly kept confessional, is far more complicated. You slip inside. The nave is empty, echoing. Dust motes drift in shafts of candlelight. Incense curls lazily above the altar, blending with the faint smell of wax, wood, old books, and old bodies. The first thing to understand is that cleanliness was spiritual, not medical. Bathing, in the eyes of many medieval churchgoers, wasn't about hygiene. It was about ritual purity, a symbolic act, not a physical one. Before Mass, before entering a holy space, one might wash the hands and face, but it wasn't soap and scrubbing. It was a few drops of holy water across the brow, a sign of reverence, not sterilization. Still, the church did maintain some traditions that looked surprisingly hygienic to modern eyes. Hand washing during the Eucharist, foot washing on Maundy Thursday, reenacting Christ's washing of the disciples' feet. Monks might bathe before feast days or perform ritual cleansings during Lent. But outside of these rituals, let's just say things got murky. You wander into a side chapel, where the stone floor is darkened from centuries of footsteps. Here, monks once knelt, cloaked in wool, their tonsured heads bowed in prayer. Their cells were tiny, their lives rigid, and their bathing schedule. Once a month, if they were lucky. Some orders, like the Cistercians, were stricter, allowing baths only a few times a year, usually tied to religious holidays. Water was precious, and too much concern for the body was seen as a distraction, or even a sin. Mortifying the flesh meant ignoring its needs. Dirt was a badge of humility, and yet, paradoxically, the church built some of the best water systems in medieval Europe. Monasteries often had running water channeled from nearby streams. Through aqueducts, sometimes even filtered. Cloisters had lavatoria, stone basins where monks could wash their hands before meals. You step into one, now a circular basin in the courtyard, still slick with moss, its drain choked with leaves. A simple thing, but revolutionary for its time. Monks were expected to wash their hands, especially before eating or handling sacred objects. Some even cleaned their feet or shaved their heads regularly. But full-body bathing? Rare and discouraged. Cleanliness, after all, might lead to vanity. And yet, despite all this, the church was obsessed with the body. Not yours, perhaps, but the bodies of saints. You wander into the reliquary now, a room cloaked in velvet and shadow, where bones glitter. In golden cases, a femur said to belong to Saint Margaret, a tooth of Saint Stephen, a scrap of cloth once worn by Saint Agnes. Relics were believed to carry divine power, healing, protection, even fertility. People traveled hundreds of miles to touch them. Some even drank water that had soaked them. No, really. There were shrines where pilgrims consumed water that had been used to bathe a saint's bone. Believing it would cure illness, you pause by one reliquary. Inside, a small glass vial holds what appears to be dried blood, allegedly from a martyr. It's dark, clotted, and revered. People kissed these relics, touched them, slept beside them. Sometimes, entire communities gathered to parade them through the streets, praying for rain, for health, for deliverance from plague. Historians still debate whether the church encouraged this level of physical contact or merely tolerated it. But there's no denying, the line between sacred and sanitary was paper thin. And then there were the miracles, often involving the body, often unsettling. One saint's body refused to rot for 200 years. Another's corpse allegedly smelled like roses. A few even bled from their tombs, inexplicably. These were signs of holiness, not hygiene. The incorruptible dead were seen as proof of God's grace. And you're standing in the middle of it all, among bones and wax figures, among chants and candle smoke, in a space where cleanliness was not of this world. You exit the chapel now and step into the churchyard, where moss grows thick on gravestones, and the earth is soft beneath your boots. There's a silence here, not just of night, but of memory. Because while the church often ignored bodily filth, it offered something else, a kind of absolution. You could be dirty, diseased, poor, lice-ridden, but if your heart was clean, if your prayers were strong, then you were welcome. Dirt did not disqualify you from grace. Of course, historians argue over this. Some believe the church used filth as a metaphor for sin, something to be cleansed. Others see its tolerance of dirt as practical compassion. But either way, the message was clear. The soul mattered more than the skin, and in a world of rot and ruin, maybe that was the only kind of cleanliness that counted. You leave the churchyard slowly, your breath forming wisps in the morning air. But the hush lingers, solemn, expectant, because while we've wandered through medieval life from the undergarments to the incense burners, there's still one chapter left to visit, the final chapter for everyone, in every century. Tonight, you walk toward death. At the edge of the graveyard lies a small crypt. The stone steps dip beneath the earth, slick with moss and worn by centuries of mourning. As you descend, the air turns colder, heavier, carrying that unmistakable scent, earth, wax, and something older. You're not alone. The dead are here. And medieval people didn't always part with them quickly. You enter a low, vaulted room lit by a few feeble candles. Bones are stacked in niches, some arranged carefully, others tossed into corners. When space ran out, a skull stares back at you from a shelf. Its jaw hangs open as if mid-sentence. Let's begin. Death was not quiet in the Middle Ages. It was loud, messy, and very, very public. And surprisingly, The process wasn't always about hiding the smell, it was about making peace with it, you see. Medieval people were obsessed with death, not in a morbid, modern horror movie way, but in a deeply religious, intimate, and yes, strangely, hygienic way. When someone died, the body was immediately prepared. The first priority, washing. The corpse was stripped and washed with clean water and herbs, often by family members or the local women trained in death rituals. Lavender, rosemary, mint, or even vinegar were used not just for scent, but as a kind of spiritual cleanse. This was the final bath, the body's last purification. Afterward, the body was dressed, sometimes in burial robes, sometimes in their best outfit, and laid out in the home. For hours, sometimes days. Yes, days. You look to a wooden platform near the far wall. It holds nothing now, just dust and a few shreds of fabric. But once, this was a wake bed, where the deceased lay as friends and family paid their respects. Prayers were whispered, tears were shed, bread and wine were passed around. Children were often present, to death was not hidden from them. But of course, there was a problem, the smell. Without refrigeration or embalming, which was rare and expensive, decomposition set in fast, especially in summer. That's where the herbs came in again. People surrounded the body with fragrant posies, incense, or even sliced lemons to mask the scent. Sometimes they'd stuff the mouth and nostrils with cloves or cotton soaked in wine. Anything to delay the inevitable. You moved toward a stone shelf where a wax effigy once lay. In some wealthy families, if a body couldn't be preserved long enough for a public funeral, they displayed a wax replica of the deceased instead. The real body, meanwhile, might already be buried or rotting elsewhere. And then, the funeral. If you were rich, you were buried in the church itself, maybe even beneath the floor, right under the altar. Sounds holy, right? Well, until the heat of summer, when gases from decomposing corpses sometimes caused tiles to lift or strange smells to waft during Mass. A bit of divine ambience no one requested. Gravediggers were essential, but not always respected. They often worked quickly, especially during times of plague, using lime to hasten decomposition. And when cemeteries filled up, older bones were dug up, cleaned, and moved to ossuaries like this one. The cycle began again. But here's where it gets weird. People visited their dead. They came to these crypts and charnel houses to pray, to talk, even to confess. Skulls were stacked like grim sentinels, but no one flinched. Death wasn't taboo, it was a daily companion. Some monasteries even kept a memento mori room, a place where monks meditated among bones, reminding themselves, remember, you must die. And people didn't just think about their own death. They prepared for it. They wrote wills requesting clean linens for burial. Some asked for a final bath, or to be wrapped in a simple shroud of unbleached linen. Others, fearing hell, left money for candlelit prayers and choirs to sing them into the next world. Spiritual febres, if you will. Historians still debate how much the average peasant feared death versus accepted it. Some say they saw it as release from pain. Others feared the rot, the judgment, the worms. Still others, especially during plague times, believed it was just fate. No more, no less. And yet there was a strange intimacy to it all. You glance again at the wall of skulls. These were not anonymous faces once. They were mothers, merchants, minstrels. People who laughed and sweated and washed barely and tried, in their own way, to clean up their lives before they disappeared. You run your fingers lightly over the stone, cool, solid. But behind it, centuries of human scent, flesh, and ritual. We like to think of hygiene as something modern. But here, in this dark room, you see the truth. Even in death, the medieval world tried to tidy up. In a world of chaos, they gave death structure, smell, sound, the incense, the herbs, the linen wraps. They were not just gestures. They were an effort to hold off the rot just a little longer. To offer dignity, to offer meaning, and maybe you're to fool the nose of God. The crypt fades behind you, the heavy stones and silent bones now just a shadow in your memory. You return to the quiet streets, where the first blush of dawn kisses the rooftops in a soft gold. Birds are just beginning to stir. A baker lights his first fire. And you're tired, but not in a bad way, because after wandering through the tangled Pungent history of medieval hygiene from steaming bathhouses to rotting graveyards. You begin to understand something odd, something surprisingly comforting. They were trying. The people of the Middle Ages, peasants, nobles, monks, mothers, midwives, they were all, in their own strange ways, trying to stay clean, clean in the body, clean in the soul, or at least clean enough to make it through another day that you find yourself walking a narrow path through the fields now, dewy grass brushing your boots. The town grows smaller behind you. In your hands, you carry a few memories, the sting of lye soap, the warm splash of scented bathwater, the bitter scent of incense curling around ancient wood, and you start to see the humor in it, like how a noblewoman would douse herself in rosewater but never wash her feet, or how people feared bathing would open their pores to demons, but had no problem rubbing urine into their clothes, or how monks believed washing too often led to vanity, but still shaved perfect circles into their heads like holy bowling balls. It's funny, yes, but also so very human. There's a softness to it all, despite the grime, a vulnerability. They didn't have antibacterial wipes or plumbing or TikToks about 10-step skincare routines. They had vinegar and lavender and hope and maybe a sponge on a stick. You step beneath a willow tree now. Its branches sway gently, like arms reaching down to hush you. The grass beneath it is dry, warm from the early sun. You sit for a moment. You let the weight of the night settle into your shoulders, and you begin to feel what they must have felt on the rare days when everything was clean. Relief. A freshly scrubbed shift, a clean pair of braids, the faint smell of herbs on skin, maybe a bath shared with friends, or a quiet moment to comb out lice beside the fire without shame. Cleanliness was not the norm, it was a luxury, but that's what made it beautiful. It was a rebellion against the mud, a soft exhale in a hard world. And now, as your eyes begin to drift closed, the final joke settles in. You, wrapped in your cozy blanket, maybe bathed and brushed and curled on a memory foam pillow, are drifting to sleep listening to the dirtiest history lesson ever told. And still, you're smiling, because maybe, just maybe, the Middle Ages weren't as foul as we thought. Or maybe they were, but the people inside them, they were just like you. Trying, scrubbing, soaking, swatting at lice, laughing at the smell, hoping no one noticed, hoping they'd be remembered for more. And now they are. Their story messy, fragrant, strangely beautiful rests with you now. So go ahead, let your mind soften. Let the clatter of the medieval world fade into the soft hum of sleep. You're safe for your clean. And the night has done its job. End of script. Sweet dreams.